But I believe that by overwhelming majority in all the Americas, you and I, in the long run, and if it be necessary, you and I will act together to protect, to defend, by every means at our command.
Welcome to the History in Motion podcast, where we discuss leaders, their decisions, and how they shape the world we live in today. In this episode of the History in Motion podcast, we dive into the story of Kim Philby, the British intelligence officer who secretly worked for the Soviet Union. As a high-ranking MI6 agent and member of the Cambridge Five, Philby's double life devastated Western intelligence and forever altered Cold War espionage. Trusted as a leader in counter-Soviet operations, Philby passed vital secrets to the KGB, shielding Soviet agents and deceiving friends and colleagues alike. His shocking defection to Moscow exposed the extent of Soviet infiltration. Join us as we explore the personal betrayals, hidden loyalties, and lasting impact of Philby's actions in one of history's greatest espionage scandals. This is the History in Motion podcast.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the History in Motion podcast, where today we're exploring a story that really kind of brings all the tension and danger and espionage and betrayal and all of those things about the Cold War to the forefront. And that's looking at a man named Kim Philby, who is basically known as Britain's most notorious double agent, maybe their greatest traitor in the history of the country. And so I think today we're really concerned more about just who was he as a person. I think the story about him being a traitor and being a double agent, these are pretty common stories, but how can someone go to be one of the top British intelligence officers and sell out all of these secrets to the Soviet Union? And why do they continue to live that double life, betray their country, betray their friends, and live this double life? I think we're really interested today to see how someone can become that person and stay doing that for decades upon decades until eventually, the chickens come home to roost.
Yeah, really well said, Paul. I think I'm very excited. I love spy history. It is definitely a passion and fascination of mine. And I think with Kim, one of the things that really stands out is that he was able to work his way to the highest ranks of intelligence in Britain, to the point where he rubbed shoulders with people like J. Edgar Hoover in the US. And here he is trading state secrets to the KGB and the Soviet Union. And I think it begs a lot of questions. One, the big one is, why would anyone want to do this? But two, how did he, work his way to such a high ranking position to be able to get away with this for the better part of, I think, almost 30 years? So 3 decades of giving away state secrets to the KGB while at the same time being able to propel himself through the, intelligence ranks of MI5 and MI6.
3 decades. That's the number that's jumping out to me because you look at this era and it's just the Red Scare, and we see, at least in the US, right, is so huge, and everyone is so terrified of the Soviet Union and communism. And you go back to the atomic bomb and all the secrets that were around that, and how everyone was so scared that the Russians would figure out, and it was all about security. Yet somebody can go all the way up in the British intelligence ranks to one of the most senior positions and be a Russian double agent for the entire time. You think you'd almost hit a plateau where it's okay, if I go to the next level, I'm probably going to have a bit more eyes on me. People are probably going to figure me out, but maybe that's kind of what worked in his favor. He was able to get so high because people trusted him. And at some point, maybe you just kind of stop looking for people like him. Oh, he's this high up. He's such a great spy. He's doing all these great things. Why would we even look at, him being a double agent? It's probably someone working lower down, or some lady off in a house somewhere who's secretly sending things back that she picks up from here and there, not someone, deep within the state. And I think that's what makes this story so fascinating, is that he's able to do all of this, like you said, while rubbing shoulders with someone like J. Edgar Hoover and other top intelligence officers, not only in Britain, but within the entire NATO apparatus.
Yeah, I think it's an incredible story. And I think one of the big things that we'll probably talk a lot about today near the tail end of the conversation is what motivates someone to do this. For the better part of their adult lives, to trade state secrets and essentially try to weaken your own country in the hopes of some, ideological motivations that we'll get into. But also, I think, as I'll jump into the context setting, shortly after this, but this era is just kind of marked by this ballooning of intelligence gathering networks, right? And I think that's partly because in the aftermath of World War II, the landscape was profoundly altered. Europe had kind of been this long-standing hub of political, cultural, and military power. But, post-World War II, the war's unprecedented destruction, across the continent reduced many countries to rubble. Infrastructure was decimated. Economies were strained to their limits. And the war's toll wasn't just physical, but I think there's an element of like this very deep psychological impact that it had. And traditional powers like Britain, France, and Germany now are very weakened economically and militarily, and they're unable to kind of reassert their former influence or even be in a position to stabilize their continent. And I think this is the power vacuum that exists in the post-World War II era. And it creates an opportunity for new global leadership. And here's where, the two superpowers emerged, and that's the United States and the Soviet Union. And they're both kind of being strengthened and buoyed by their wartime mobilization. And they, were able to get out of World War II with relatively intact economies and military capabilities. But each power kind of had a very distinct vision for the world in a post-war era. And I think those differences are really key to this conversation. It's not just reflecting, different economic systems, which is definitely an aspect of it, but what we're going to see is like fundamentally opposing ideologies. You have the US that's promoting capitalism, democracy, free markets, individual freedoms, and they see these values as essential to a prosperous state and, stable world order. Whereas the Soviet Union, by contract, is championing communism and a very, singular focus on centralized state control. They envision a society free from class divisions and economic exploitation. So for the USSR, the war had kind of proven the power of the socialist states to mobilize resources and to defend against other imperial threats. So it emerges, kind of determined to keep expanding its influence over Eastern Europe, where Soviet forces to kind of push back the Nazis in World War II. Flip side of that coin, the US has kind of proven their own case about how much you can actually accomplish with, this free market capitalistic approach on actually being able to, mobilize their military and come to the support of the Allied forces in World War II as well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting as you talk a little bit about just how the war kind of brought those economies up and made them such superpowers. Because at the same time, right, there's the whole piece of this Cold War, right, is they all want to have their influence. They want to push their ideology, but they all know that they can't get into another hot war like they just did because it may be the war to end all wars. And that's where I think we see this espionage ring really blow up. Because if you look, I thought was interesting from the research was, you think you'd go back to like the Napoleonic Wars and there would be so much espionage within all these different courts and things like that. But it happened, but it wasn't really even close to the levels that we saw into World War II. Even World War I, not to the same extent. World War II is really when we're starting to see these countries realize that there's a lot to gain from these spy apparatuses, but they weren't really professionalized in the same way. But then coming into the Cold War, right? Like how else are you supposed to push your ideology into random other countries that you don't want to physically put troops into, but you don't want the Soviets to be doing the same thing. You don't want the Americans. And so now you get this like ideological battle being fought through these proxies, but this spy apparatus is so huge because if you can know what the other guys are thinking, what they're planning, these are plans that might take years and years to develop. And so being, able to understand what the other guys are doing, but also get on the forefront, get boots on the ground unofficially and, without any sort of formal allegiances to any country. This is their kind of way of jumping around this potential, hey, we're not actually involved. But this is what you see really in the Cold War is this expansion, not just because I think technology and everything is changing, which is obviously a factor, but it's just kind of out of necessity, I think, because you're not going to be fighting in the trenches like you were in World War I. You're going to be fighting, in the back rooms and you're going to be sneaking around trying to figure things out in that sense.
No, I think you nailed it. I think that whole element of like cloak and dagger, spy is really kind of emerges here. And I think to your earlier point on, the Cold War not being a hot war, because there is an element of mutually ensured destruction at this point with the, arms race for nuclear weapons. And I think, World War II in some ways gave the US and the Soviet Union a common enemy, right? But once Nazi Germany fell, those tensions quickly arised again. And I think, they were always there, but, they had kind of taken a backseat towards the imminent threat, which was Nazi Germany in Europe. And I think, post World War II, after the fall of Nazi Germany, now you're in a position where that ideological rivalry begins to, pick up speed again and kind of becomes the forefront on people's minds. And I think if you're looking at it from like a US perspective, and obviously we're in Canada, it's important to kind of understand that a lot of leaders feared that this would kind of lead to a domino effect that would spread socialism, communism, and this kind of totalitarian rule across Europe, potentially into Asia and other regions. So American leaders really did believe in the principles of self-determination. They wanted to support the establishment of democratic governments. So the clash between the Soviet security demands and American ideals kind of laid that groundwork for a very deep, enduring mistrust between the East and the West. And I think there's a pretty famous quote from Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, which he kind of provided this very stark symbol, which is from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. And I think that's a very important message at this point in time, because that iron curtain, it's not just a physical boundary that's drawn on maps. It's a massive ideological chasm at this point. And it's a dividing line that's kind of marking the boundaries of territorial influences, values, and governance. And that kind of sets the stage for a very prolonged confrontation that would essentially shape, international relations for the next 50 some odd years.
Yeah, even longer than that, right? We're still seeing the remnants of that today. And I think too, what's interesting about that Iron Curtain, right, is, we think of it in our head of east of that is Soviet influence, west of that is more capitalist, democratic influence. But obviously, it's not a hard line in the sand. And I think what's interesting about our discussion today is you start to see the dissent coming on both sides. You see people growing up in the communist world who are like, hey, I'm not about this life. I really want to see the Soviet Union fall and become more like the West, versus the other side where you might see people in the West saying, our country should be more communist, or I would love to see the Soviet Union rise and have more power and be able to do the type of influence that they want. And so I think it's interesting as we see people growing up in completely different worlds and completely different ideologies, having this deep hatred for the ideology that they're grown up into and almost kind of wanting to literally switch teams. And we see it on both sides, I think, which is so fascinating because, that line in the sand is drawn. You start to see the dissent coming on both sides. And, that's where the world of double agents and all of these types of things that we're going to talk about today come from, which I think makes for a pretty intriguing story. Yeah,
I think that's definitely, one of the things that really attracts me to this part of history in this era is that, what would ever motivate someone to be a traitor in many regards, right? Like, I think plain and simple, that's kind of an apt term to kind of describe people like Kim Philby, because they are traitors. They're giving away state secrets. And I think in this environment, right, like espionage kind of becomes essential because it is a Cold War, right? It cannot be a hot war because there's an arms race going on. And if someone hits the red button to launch a nuke, the same thing's going to happen on the other side of the globe, and everyone's destruction is kind of guaranteed at that point. So intelligence gathering and these kind of covert operations now become tools through which these superpowers can kind of undermine the other without sparking an upright war, which is kind of funny in some circumstances because they both knew they were doing it and they just kept doing it. But spies and informants at this point, they provide invaluable insights in some extent into military capabilities, political strategies, potential technological advancements. And this is ultimately to support, each side's struggle for global influence. And this era is marked by these countries trying to extend their influence into areas like Africa, Asia, Latin America, and both the US and USSR sought support from these regimes that were most aligned with their ideologies. So you have things like proxy wars, propaganda campaigns, and coups. They become very common as both sides, fought for influence in the, quote unquote third world.
Yeah, you're right. Because if you're not able to get your foot in the door somewhere through kind of like, again, you're not going to roll into Vietnam, bad example, but you're not going to roll into some of these other countries that are kind of teetering on the edge between communism and democratic values and throw troops in and say, hey, we're here, because that's going to open up something, right? So you have a lot of this, like I said, these espionage rings kind of coming up. But I think it's always fascinating too around how much these espionage rings and intelligence gathering exercises actually make an impact. Like we know for sure in World War II that there was definitely some especially around like the D-Day landings and the deception around that. It absolutely made a difference. But, when you're spying for so long, I always wonder, I think Ben McIntyre talks about this a little bit. He talks about like a lot of it just canceled each other out. And so at the end of the day, you're just kind of spying to almost keep the status quo, if that makes sense. It's not really pushing you along. Maybe there's, a big defection or you uncover something quite extreme on the technological side that will work. But at the end of the day, you're just kind of giving little tips here and there. And eventually it kind of evens itself out and doesn't maybe make as much of a difference as those intelligence people would think. And it almost becomes a bit of a pride thing too, right? Of, oh yeah, we were able to grab this from the other side, or, oh my God, we got someone to defect. That's a huge political win. And so I think that's also important to remember too. It's kind of shady and in the back room and, those backroom deals and those sort of things. But whenever this kind of stuff comes up to the surface, there's this big political element that people like to latch onto as well. So I think it's an interesting piece to think about as we get into Kim Philby and his eventual defection on what the political ramifications are going to be. And then vice versa, right? If someone comes from the Soviet Union to the West, it's like a national embarrassment and a national triumph, depending on, which side you're looking at.
Yeah, I think one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist type of anecdote really applies here. And I think right before we get into Kim, because he is the focal point of this conversation, maybe just a quick lay of the land in terms of the organizations and the intelligence apparatuses that we'll be talking about today. There's more, but I think these are kind of like the key chess pieces on the board during this conversation to keep in mind. Everyone's heard of the CIA. This is the Central Intelligence Agency based out of the US. Their objective essentially, as they were created to do, is counter Soviet influence globally and protect U.S. interests abroad. Then you have MI6. So this is the SIS, or Secret Intelligence Service of the United Kingdom. Similar kind of mandate to the CIA, counter Soviet espionage and communist influence while protecting British interests. You have MI5. You could kind of compare them to the FBI, I think, is a reasonable analogy. Their focus is really on internal security and counter-espionage within the UK. Probably interesting to note that MI6 and MI5, not the greatest working relationships, which is always interesting. I think there's probably a shared sentiment there between the CIA and FBI. And then you have the KGB. So this is the Committee for State Security within the Soviet Union. And, like their counterparts, their goal is to gather intelligence on Western powers, protect Soviet interests, and support global communist expansion.
So yeah, I think we've been talking a lot about what team you're on. It's funny you put it in that sense, because all I kept thinking about is like, in this corner you have the KGB, and in this corner you have the CIA, and then, the MI6 gets tapped in for, the second round or something like that. But it really comes down to that is, like I said, it almost becomes almost like a sport and a little bit of a battle between these guys on who can win, who can be better. So I think that'll be important as we go through the conversation. But I think let's introduce Kim and, talk a little bit about his life, because, coming into this, I thought, I heard he was part of the Cambridge Five and went to the University of Cambridge. And so my first thought was, typical upper class, kind of snobby British upbringing. And to an extent, there's a little element of that, but his life is quite different, because first off, he's not even born in England. He's born in British India to a family with some pretty deep colonial ties, but his father's a fascinating guy. So his father, John Philby, was a senior British official and an expert on the Arab world. And so his father had a little bit of a rebellious streak as well. He kind of became very critical of British policies, especially in the Middle East, and really kind of goes native, for lack of a better term. He really embraces the Islamic and Arabic life that he's studying, and actually ends up converting to Islam, has an Arabic name at some point, and is really anti-establishment, pro kind of this, getting the British out of, maybe not doing things in the sense of like a rebellion or anything like that, but definitely has the intellectual thoughts around, this anti-colonial sentiment, and, really goes all in with living almost a brand new life within the Arabic world, which was very different than I thought I was going to come into this. I definitely thought his father was going to be more of a, traditional British person, but now I think his story starts to make a little bit more sense as you start to see, this is the person who raised him. And, I'm sure those conversations they had as kids were not very, pro-colony, pro-imperial empire, and especially as he's starting to grow up into the 20s and 30s, the common narrative around empire is starting to change, and he's getting it from society, but also within his own home.
I think that's such an important footnote in this entire discussion, is that, so I was listening to this great podcast, True Spies Espionage, and their whole objective is to talk about things like we're talking about in this episode, and they go very deep. And we were talking offline about this, and they were actually able to find or acquire a copy of Kim Philby's unreleased memoirs that were not vetted by the KGB posthumously. And there is a chapter in, I guess, in those memoirs that they reread, and he actually talks about his time in, colonial India. And I think that, like, just based on what was communicated and what was written, it seems like this had a very long-lasting impact on him, on the trials and tribulations and pitfalls of this kind of imperial rule and how they, subjugated locals. And there was this, grandiosity and how much better that we were than these others that we were governing over. And I think that stuck with him for a long time, right? Because why else would anyone want to trade secrets for 30 years when this high stakes game of espionage? So I think it is, I think this sentiment is really important for us to underpin as we kind of go throughout this entire conversation.
Absolutely, because we came into this conversation saying, why do any of this? And again, it's easy to look back and say, well, there you go. His father was telling him Britain was bad the whole time. And so he made it his mission to, destroy Britain. Like, definitely not the case. But of course, he's going to have these thoughts in the back of his mind. And as he kind of grows up, we'll see where those thoughts are kind of shaped a little bit. So the first thing about Kim Philby is Kim is not actually his name. It was a nickname. And he was actually named after a boy spy in Rudyard Kipling's novel called Kim. So, it's almost a tale almost too good to even make up, right? Like, he's named after a boy spy, ends up becoming a spy. But he does have a pretty traditional British life. He goes to a prep school, which is an all boys school. But then he goes something very different. He goes and spends time with his father in the Arabian desert and kind of lives that life for a little bit before coming back to Britain to go to the Westminster School, where he graduated at the age of 16 before he ended up moving to Cambridge and graduating in 1933. So, if we're looking at time frames here, 20s and 30s, this is when the communist kind of movements in the Western world are probably at their peak or pretty close to it, especially within the intellectual elite. If we think back to our Oppenheimer episode, he's growing up or kind of moving through the American university system at this time, and discussions around communism are so huge. There's no difference in the UK at this time, and he's starting to hear these new ideas, think about these new ideas, and meet like-minded people who are starting to think of these same ideas. And so this whole kind of communist mindset is really finding its way into these young intellectuals. And as we'll get into, a lot of these spies are recruited out of these elite universities. So you have a bit of a problem here, because you're trying to find the best and the brightest, but they're sometimes almost the most rebellious. And they're looking for new ideas and fresh ideas. And sometimes that ends up being communism. In the 30s, it's not as anti-communism, isn't as hardline as it is in the 50s and 60s. But you're starting to see a little bit of worry on, hey, if people are moving in the ideologically in the wrong direction, but they're super smart, what do we do in this situation? So this is what's kind of happening. And Kim's right in the middle of all of this.
I think this is one of those themes that really stuck with me after reading Ben McIntyre's book and then doing research for this episode. And by the way, the book's called A Spy Among Friends. What is so captivating, right? Why the lure of this ideology? Why would a Western citizen turn to this Eastern communist ideal? And it's not just, any citizen that we're talking about. We're talking about highly educated elites and academics. What is it about this group that makes them more likely to, subvert the Western ideals and be more attracted to the Eastern ones? I think this was something that I kind of doubled down on a little bit. And this is just the theory that I will posit. I don't know if it's right, but this is my thoughts. I think in some ways, and I think, Paul, you kind of touched on this a bit, is that communism attracted many intellectuals and elites in the early mid to 20th century because it presented an alternative to the perceived failings of capitalism, especially in the wake of the things like the Great Depression, World War II. That promise of this classless, equitable society appealed to those who saw capitalism as exploitative and unstable. Communism offers at least in theory, a very structured framework for understanding and addressing those social inequalities, and gives intellectuals a sense of purpose in this kind of global movement for social justice. I think for many, and I think you touched on this as well, is that who's likely to have a high degree of openness and open-mindedness to new radical ideas? It's often going to be academics. It's often going to be these elite groups who have, the leisure time to think about theoretical frameworks and ways to structure society. Someone who's working at a factory 14 hours a day is probably not that concerned with many of these things. So I think for many in that part of society, communism represents a powerful stance against this rising fascism. And it almost seems like there's this degree of moral imperative during a time of political turmoil. And I think when we look at like the Cambridge Five, which we'll talk about shortly, and this educated elite, they're often interested in radical ideas that are critical of the status quo. So things like Marcus theory are growing in the zeitgeist. People are becoming more interested in them. But then there's this like other contention. These are educated people who have to take facts as facts. So I wonder, and this is just an open question, as reports of authoritarianism and repression in the Soviet Union start to emerge, how disillusioned can you really be? Right? Start seeing these very stark contrasts between communist ideals and the realities of how it's actually happening on the ground. So I think this period of like ideological exploration amongst intellectuals kind of, for me at least, highlights how the initial appeal was about addressing social inequalities and looking for alternatives to capitalism. But at the same time, they had to be able to reconcile the on the ground realities of how oppressive that regime actually was.
Yeah, I think your theory makes a lot of sense. And especially that last piece on how can you justify what you're seeing. And I think you do see some people who are more of the, we'll call them intellectual communists, who start to see the realities of the Soviet Union and change their tune, quite quickly. But I think we have to remember too, maybe 100 years before the time we're talking about, it was a very much an aristocratic monarchical rule, king, queen, ultimate power, small group of nobles, they own everything. And over the next century, things are starting to get chipped away, where you start to get more people from the regular classes being able to rise up in society. And I think that transition is still happening, in the sense that, the king and queens are having a little bit less power. It's becoming more of a parliament system, especially in Britain. But you still have this like elite, rich British society or European society, whatever it might be. And people are still seeing that going, is this it? Is this the best we can get to? Communism might be the next logical step instead of going along the direction we're going on, because in their eyes, things have plateaued. So that's part of it. But I think the other piece too is this rise of fascism, I think can't be underlooked, because if you're sitting there seeing what's happening in Germany, what's happening in Italy, and then what's happening in Spain, you see these democratically elected governments being overthrown by these tyrants. And you're starting to think, well, communism offers the complete, on paper, opposite solution to this, where everybody is equal and everybody has a say, versus, capitalism, which kind of sits in the middle, where you have a little bit of stronger powers in the hands of a few, but everybody's supposed to have a vote, versus fascism, which is just pure power from the top. But I think part of what we see is, as that falls, they start to realize that, maybe fascism isn't as big of a risk anymore, and maybe communism isn't as interesting, because now it's just kind of two choices, and I'm not so worried about, fascism taking over in the sense that it was. So I think, that's something that Philby and a lot of his contemporaries are going to be thinking about, is they don't want their country to turn into Spain or to Italy or to Germany, is because I've seen the devastation that's bringing in the 30s, and then even more so after the war. So these are things that I think they're contending with, because the future's changing, or the current day is changing so quickly, and the future is so uncertain. And part of the reason why World War II ends up kicking off and kind of grounding everything a little bit, and putting a little bit of, less uncertainty into the future. But this is another huge piece, right, that they need to contend with, is what the heck is the next 10, 20 years going to look like from a political stage? And is everybody just going to become fascist again? And then we go back to the way the things used to be? And, especially if you have some empathy and you're trying to see how the working man is doing and all of these sort of things, and they're struggling at this point as well, going back to the old ways, is completely against what they're looking for politically, and even from just an emotional and human standpoint.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Like, I think it definitely underpins a lot of his motivations, because I believe, in the 30s, Philby actually traveled to Spain, and this was the first time that he was in contact with Soviet operatives. And this was, that kind of primary connection that would, lead into the rest of his career.
Yeah, absolutely. So he's done some stuff too, where he's going into, I think it was Vienna, and he was helping out, and he met some people there, and you start to just see these conversations are happening. It's not just a thing Cambridge too, right? He's meeting just regular people who are moving more into the communist side of the ideology. So he's hearing it from a lot of people, and he's meeting a lot of smart people who are thinking that communism is the right thing. And so I think that also has an impact too, right? He's a smart guy. He meets smart people who are on his level intellectually, and now they're starting to talk about these ideas. Definitely brings these people closer together, and I think he has a little bit of respect for that. But it is in 1934 when he catches the eye of the Soviet recruiter. So it was a KGB officer named Arnold Deutsch who initiated him into this kind of espionage part of the world. And they really saw his intelligence and his ability to make social connections as a perfect opportunity for someone who could become a double agent within the KGB apparatus. And so their strategy being the Soviets, was pretty clever. They just kind of said, don't do anything. Don't blow up bridges or any of that stuff. Just blend in. Be a regular Englishman. Bide your time. Wait for the right moment. And I think this is the key with Philby, is he was so effective at what he did because he had impeccable charm. He was able to live this lifestyle. He had a knack for getting people to trust him. He was witty, charismatic, and just easy in social situations. And this works both ways, right? It brings people to trust him, but also gets him respect. And this is what starts to help him move up the ranks in the British intelligence system, where he's able to gain access to this new information without so much suspicion. He really wasn't a spy. He was the type of spy everyone wanted to be friends with. So they couldn't really imagine that he would have any other motives, because look at this person. He's everything you would want in the quote unquote nice guy, right? And so I think part of what I came away with this is you can see why so many spy books and spy novels and movies are written by former spies, because, we look at someone like Bond, right? That's all you can think about is, the 007 lifestyle of good-looking guy living this kind of shady lifestyle behind the scenes, but just everybody has this respect and reverence for him. And so when I look at someone like Kim Philby, I think obviously Bond is a Hollywood version of this, but you can see, right, he's able to, come in and order his martini and work a room, but then he's able to, jump from building to building, or, find his way in the back rooms and figure out something that's happening, and work the room and work people in the back office. Like, it's just all of these things. They all seem like they're happening at once, but it's almost two completely different people, that are doing it. And I think that's what really stood out for me when kind of reading about how he finally made his way into this world and was able to stay there for so long.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. I think a couple of things come to mind. One, the networking aspect of it and how important that is, right? Like, if you're gathering intelligence, whether it's trying to recruit spies or gather human intelligence or being able to be that kind of power broker of relationships, your network is so crucial. But in the same vein, he has to keep up appearances and to build those networks with those people. And I guess there's also this element of like the old boys club, right? Like, in terms of, whose dad works for which, government arm. And, there's just like this unofficial networking or recruitment agency or recruitment process that's happening because of these established connections already. He's able to kind of leverage and work off of that while maintaining his appearances and, staying true to what his handlers from the KGB wanted him to do. Because in many respects, the Russians are known at this point in time from an espionage perspective to play the long game, right? Like, lay idle, like, do what you keep doing. And when the time is right, you'll know.
Yeah, it's a clever strategy too, because they can clearly see how the British society works. It's trust with people within that circle. And there's definitely these unofficial social ranks. And if you can infiltrate one of those ranks with even one person, you essentially have access to the entire social ranks. So I think it's a very clever strategy, and it works particularly well within the British high society at that point. So if we kind of move on a little bit, it's World War II. It's in the early years. He joins the British intelligence community and is assigned to MI6, where, like we said, he's a smart guy. He really works well in the intelligence world, and people are really starting to trust him and giving him more and more responsibility, especially in the war. Things are moving so quickly. They need good people in the right roles. So he's assigned to the Secret Intelligence Service and begins working in the Iberian section of the service. So he's monitoring Nazi activities within Spain and Portugal. So, by this time, he's done all this work, and now he's kind of seen as this like anti-fascist hero, where he's positioned very well with Britain's wartime stance. Fascism is awful. We need to defeat it. And, for most people, that makes a lot of sense. They're the enemy, but eventually they're going to be defeated and a new enemy is going to rise. So in 1944, the Allies are starting to realize that, or the Allies minus the Soviet Union are starting to realize that the Soviets, they're moving west and they're not liberating, they're conquering at this point, and they're putting up their sphere of influence around the areas that they conquer. And they realize that these ideologies are going to clash. And as soon as Germany is defeated, there's not going to be a very long peace between the West and the East. And so what do? They look at Mr. Kim Philby and they promote him to the position in the British counterintelligence world where he's supposed to lead all efforts against the Soviet Union. So right away, I want to know who made that appointment, because they're missing a lot of things here. So, even there's an incident where he recommended MI6 coordinate with Soviet allies to extract important intelligence. But what his colleagues didn't realize was his intention was to tip off the KGB about these operations, which allowed them to dismantle British networks in Eastern Europe. So, this is just an example of, okay, he's in this role and he's making some suggestions on, hey, we're still allies with the Soviets, so maybe we should share some things with them. But really, he's just doing it to kind of let the KGB know of, okay, here's who you need to either take out or clean up, for lack of a better term, when you start to move west. So it's already starting to begin. And again, it's just funny that he's put into that position. Of all positions they could give him, probably the absolute worst one.
It's incredible. I think this is one of those points in his timeline that are just so incredible to fathom. Imagine being put in that position that you're now leading the counterintelligence against the Soviet Union with your true alignment being with the Soviet Union. Like, how, as a counterintelligence spy, could you have asked for a better position? And this is just a thing with him. He finds himself in these positions throughout his career where he's able to inflict the most amount of damage to Britain while serving the Soviet Union. Like, it is truly incredible.
Yeah, I guess like he finds his way in. He knows what he wants to do, and again, like we said, he's like, we can only say he's so good at what he does, but like, you just keep looking at the results, right? Like, he's able to just join the war, do what he needs to do. And now he's in what's going to be one of the most important positions in the entire British counterintelligence service. So, we have to ask ourselves a little bit, how is he able to do some of these things? He's able to essentially almost detach emotionally from a lot of things. And he reportedly told friends, to betray, you must first belong. And so it's funny he's saying that because it works for the work he's trying to do on paper, but also for what he's doing behind the scenes. He's in the group, he belongs, and now he's able to betray. And so he felt, though, that I think he belonged more to the ideological case, or to the cause, I should say, than the country he was born into. But what does it take to live a double life? You're playing these two roles every day. And I think what psychologists, and Ben McIntyre talks about this too in his book, is they're so good, these double agents, at compartmentalization. They're able to almost have I almost think of it as like two brains. You have one brain that's on, and it's the, Kim Philby, the British high society guy working in counterintelligence. And, when he's in a party or in a social setting, he's not even thinking in the back of his head of, oh, I better not get caught. I better not do this. Just lock in and be the person that you need to be. But then when it comes time to spy for the Soviets, turn off all of that. Don't worry about your friends. Don't worry about your country. Get the job done and get it and do it right and do it well. And I think that's what makes people like Kim and other counterintelligence officers who are doing these double lives so successful, because they're able to almost, it's like a switch, like turn it off, turn it back on. And you see that even with like athletes and stuff, right? When they get in the zone, they're just on. And then when they're off, the field or the ice, it's completely different. And I think that's kind of the way we have to think about it is, yeah, it's tough for people like us to think, oh my God, how would someone be able to do that? But if you're able to just break apart and be almost, I wouldn't, not even split personality, but almost two complete identities, and you're able to separate the two, you're going to be very, very successful. And I think that goes to show why Kim was so good at what he did.
Yeah, I think the psychological implications of this are pretty crazy, right? There's other examples of people who weren't able to do it as well as Kim, who would not have been able to endure this counterespionage for, 30 plus years throughout his career. It becomes more and more difficult to compartmentalize. And then I think you see the introduction of certain elements to help, spies cope with the everyday stressors of being a covert agent. And I think you see things like drinking, partying, in excess to help load balance all the stressors of every day. But it's so interesting though, right? Like to be able to host an elite social gathering filled with drink, champagne, jokes amongst the highest ranking Secret Service officials. And then, the next morning go meet with your Soviet handler in, some remote town in Britain. But you have to, it's called dry cleaning, quote unquote, where if you're going somewhere, take 5 different modes of transportation, go in the most roundabout way possible. So in case you have any tails, you lose them so you can meet your KGB operative and then go back to living your regular life 4 hours later or whatever that time is.
Can you imagine the thrill though of all of that? I think when you watch a James Bond movie, it's the thrill, right? Of, are you going to get caught? Is today the day something's going to happen? Or, oh, you actually got away with it. And I think that has to drive a lot of what these guys do, is the game, right? The chase, the excitement of, can I keep doing this and not getting caught? And I wonder at what some point, with if it's Kim Philby or any of these other guys, like, when did the love for Soviet ideology end? And I think we'll get into that in a little bit later. But I think part of it is, he had to know what he was doing, right? He's sending off these reports to the Soviet Union. He knows people are getting executed or sent to the gulag. He claims he's able to compartmentalize and say, well, I'm doing this for the cause and the ideology. But I wonder if part of it is just, it's the game. I need to win. I need to continue to do what I'm doing. And I think for him, that's probably part of it. And also too, like you had mentioned the drinking and everything like that. And we probably need to bring up the Cambridge 5 here, because I think it's a great compare and contrast, right? Because you have 5 people from Cambridge who were all part of this British intelligence service, who all defected, or not fully defected initially, but were part of this double agent lifestyle. And 2 of them being Guy Burgess and Donald MacLean, who defected to the Soviet Union only in 1951. So they didn't last long at all, because, and I think we talked about this offline, was Guy Burgess was much more of, we'll say, degenerate versus someone like Kim Philby. Wasn't as buttoned up, liked to drink, liked to party, liked to be a little bit more loose with his words, probably. Still very good spies, but at the same time, they weren't able to last as long within this apparatus, and they had to defect much sooner. So I think it's interesting to see, like, yes, there's the game element to it, but at what point does the crack start to find? When do you start to slip up? When do you start to make mistakes? And I think with some of these guys, right, is maybe they didn't have quite the skill of someone like Kim, who was able to fully compartmentalize and ground themselves a little bit more versus, living a little bit more of a debauched lifestyle, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, I think that it's incredible, right? Guy Burgess is probably deserving of his own episode, but this is someone who is like radically different than Kim Philby. He is much more debaucherous. He's much more loose-lipped. He drinks a lot more, and he is extremely eccentric and does not try very well to hide any of those realities. But I think, like, when we're talking about the Cambridge 5, there's obviously this kind of network that we're talking about. And I know we touched on like intellectual elites and academic circles and the popularity of communism within this particular social group. But on the inverse, like, thinking about how this exposes some of the systemic issues in British intelligence is pretty awe-inspiring, right? Like, there are some deep-seated flaws here when it comes to the British intelligence gathering apparatus, like the inadequacy of their vetting procedures. These are well-known spies that have endured in terms of their legacy and in terms of how big of an impact they were able to have in terms of trading and giving away British and even US state secrets, because they did have, they did liaison, some of them, with the US. And it brings to light the British intelligence inadequate vetting procedures and their over-reliance on social class as a trust factor. This is one of those things that really stuck out to me. So, I think many people within MI5 and MI6 would have been very reluctant to believe that men from privileged upper class backgrounds could ever harbor loyalty to a foreign power, let alone Russia. And I think this realization at the tail end of this, when it all came to light, must have just been such a, watershed moment for them to really understand, like, wow, how have we been doing things and how could this have happened to us?
I think that's the perfect way to put it, right? Philby was saying you need to be able to trust before you can betray. And they're able to get into this world, which has been built off these relationships for so long, for generations, right? Of our families have been doing business together forever. We're all part of this elite noble class, but it's starting to change a little bit because you're not necessarily born into it. You kind of have to earn your way a little bit into it, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to revert back to the old ways of doing things, because that is the way you were in power and you maintain control. And these guys are like, hey, we're just guys at the end of the day, right? But we're incredibly smart and incredibly highly educated. So, you start to see a little bit of that of, yeah, you're part of this circle, and that's the way we've always done it. If you're in the circle, you're one of us. Beautiful. Let's move on, right? But yeah, you definitely see, I don't think they were able to adapt a little bit to, some of the changing times. But if we continue on with Kim Philby, it's not smooth sailing for him. He's definitely very good at what he does, but he is definitely being called upon for investigations, trials, things like that, where people are starting to accuse him of being Soviet spy because they know for a fact that information is getting out. And there's even some times where he's actually been assigned to find himself, which I think is the most interesting part of all of this, where they're like, hey, we know there's a Soviet spy somewhere. Kim, you got to go find this guy. And he's like, great, I'll get right on it. So another fun part is he's got to feed back junk information, but also make it look like he's actually doing something, because he obviously, if he does his job well, he finds himself and it doesn't work out very well. So that's part of what he's looking for. They know that someone like this exists. But Philby's not just got a good relationship within British intelligence. He's got a really good relationship within the CIA as well. And he has some pretty high ranking people there who are, vouching for him and saying, yeah, he's a great person, nothing to worry about. And this kind of leads to a few close calls for him where, he's going through different trials. And especially in 1955, he's had to famously say, I'm not a communist. I've never been a communist, which, he definitely didn't believe himself, but he needed to show this to say, hey, I'm not part of this spy ring that you guys think exists. And especially with the Cambridge Five, right? It's not the Five yet. So he's, there's never enough proof to really say that he's the Soviet spy. And he's always exonerated every time it comes up. But eventually you can start to see the suspicion is probably going to start to wear at him a little bit. And what he did is he actually took a journalistic post in Beirut, which allowed him to work covertly still, but he's not as close to the MI6 offices in London. So he's maybe not getting the absolute top information all the time, but he's able to kind of go off and do his own thing. So he's, he's posing as a journalist, but very much still an MI6 operative, which is interesting because it kind of goes all the way back to his father, right? Living in this Arab world in the Middle East. And he's able to go into Lebanon and live that life and fit in probably quite well because he knows, that culture very well. So you can start to see the cracks are starting to form, but at the same time, he's obviously very good at covering his tracks. And he's very good at bringing the right people into his corner, where he's continually able to do this, well into the 1960s, which, that's 25 plus years since the end of the war. So, things are starting to change for him. Sorry, not 25, 15 plus years since the end of the war. So, things are starting to change, but it's going to take something that's not necessarily his own faults, that's going to eventually do him in at the end.
I think that's such a good point, right? Because there's going to be cracks. There's going to be things that happen, accumulatively over somebody's career at this point where you're leaking information. And I think it's probably important for listeners to understand that there's human capital on the line, right? People are going to die with the information that Philby is leaking. There is a human cost to this. And I think this is a quick example. So one of the most damaging leaks that I kind of was able to pinpoint was an operation called Operation Valuable in 1949. So it was a joint MI6 and CIA mission to overthrow Albania's communist regime. So as a double agent, Philby revealed critical details to the KGB. And essentially this allowed those Albanian security forces to intercept, capture, and execute operatives. The estimates go from anywhere from dozens to hundreds up to 300 was the largest estimate of people dying. And if you think about the implications of this, not only did people die, but this is a massive failure. It's resulting in numerous casualties. It's casting serious doubts on the safety and effectiveness of any similar joint intelligence missions, and it's damaging trust between agencies, and it's creating a deeper wedge between MI6 and the CIA, which is exactly what the KGB wants, while at the same time it's strengthening the Soviet-Russian satellite states by isolating Western intelligence. And this is just one example over a 30-year career. So just imagine the breadth of what he's been able to do and impact over the entirety of his, time in his position.
And we don't even know what else he's been doing just because, a lot of the British intelligence stuff has been unsealed. Some of it hasn't, but there's a lot probably in those Soviet archives of things that he was throwing to them that we have no idea about. So I can only imagine. You're right. That's a perfect example, hundreds of people dying. And, part of me is like, oh my God, how could he do such a thing? And, but at the end of the day, this is, if you also look too, right, if there's a communist regime in Albania and the West wants to overthrow it, that's also not the most noble cause either. And so they're thinking of this like a war, right? This is a battle. This is who's going to win. And, he's a soldier in this war is kind of how he's seeing it, not on the front lines, but doing what he can to help decide that he ultimately wants to win. And I think you make a great point too about not sharing as much information between the CIA and MI6 and these other institutions, because if they're not able to work well together, especially because they have different people in different areas, that just strengthens the Soviets and then eventually the satellite states, like you were saying. So yeah, we asked at the beginning, how much effect does this have on the actual, outcome to a lot of these wars and a lot of these conflicts? There's a clear example right there where the Soviets won the day because of some leaked information where who knows how it may have gone differently, but, you can conclusively say that, many people were killed on the side of the West just because of, information Kim Philby pushed forward. And so we go back to Kim in Beirut, and he's continuing to live the life that, he's always lived. We didn't really get into it much, but, he's a womanizer. He's on multiple wives, mistresses, likes a drink. He's not maybe as much as some of the other Cambridge Five were in that side of the things. But again, I think to live this lifestyle, these guys they need to kind of let loose because, again, the compartmentalization, and I can only imagine what that's doing to their brains. But ultimately, what finally does Kim Philby is, in 1963, a defector named Anatoliev Goldstein is defecting from the Soviet Union. So he's the complete opposite of Kim Philby, doesn't want to see the Soviet Union continue to succeed, and he actually defects to the West. And what he brings over is a ton of information pointing to Kim Philby as this mole inside the British Secret Service. So he's under questioning at this point. They question him a little bit, saying, hey, we're seeing some things. And Kim Philby's not a dumb guy. He clearly realizes, this is it. I'm finished. They're going to catch me for sure. And he slips away and defects to the Soviet Union. So he's got away, which is one thing. But I mentioned this early on. Can you imagine the political ramifications, right? Because this is such a huge win for the West. They've just got a Soviet defector over. Everybody's excited. The KGB's embarrassed. And now they do the opposite, right? And it's, oh yeah, well, look who we've had in your camp for the last 30 plus years. And you guys had no idea. And like you were saying, like, we've seen so many of these defectors going over to the Soviet Union out of Cambridge, and now you got another one. And I'm sure that creates more hysteria around what was going on. But I just like to think of the national embarrassment, but also triumph, depending on which side you're looking at with his ultimate defection.
It's an incredible story, right? Regardless of which side you're on, just the fact that he was able to do what he did for such an enduringly long time is incredible. And then the fact that he was able to defect and actually leave Britain and move to Russia, where he would spend the rest of his life. And I think, when he passes away, he's given like a massive ceremonial burial, and parade, because he was a state hero. It's incredible for Russia for the success, because in my mind, I can't think of another example that would even touch Kim in terms of like what this did for Soviet Russia, but also how bad it looked for Britain intelligence. Like, I think there's no one that even comes close to how long Philby was able to do this and sneak away after the fact.
Yeah, and I think for someone like Philby too, we always ask, is the juice worth the squeeze, right? He's not a dumb guy. He knows he's going to get caught eventually. Maybe doesn't fully believe it, but he knows that he's probably going to have to defect to Moscow. And the thing is, he hates living in the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. His life just spirals out of control at that point. He liked to drink to begin with. He actually wrote in his memoir, the hardest thing in the world to turn down was a drink. So as time goes on, right, he's living in Russia and Moscow, and he's basically really falling into some deep alcoholism. And I think for him, he talks about how he misses Britain. He misses the people that he grew up with. And I think part of it is, he sold these people out, but I wonder if he's got a little bit of buyer's remorse at this point, because he misses his home. He misses the people that he grew up with. He doesn't really like living in Moscow anymore. And he's lost that big excitement in his life. Being this double agent, something he'd been doing for so long, has been ripped away from him. And I can only imagine he went in probably some sort of deep depression, trying to figure out what the heck he's going to do with his life. Despite being seen as a national hero, I don't necessarily think in his case being seen as a national hero is necessarily what drove him. I think ultimately it was probably started as an ideological movement of, hey, I think communism is the right thing and I want the Soviet Union to succeed. But I think as time goes on, this has just became his life, a way of life for him. This is what he was comfortable with, and he was something he was good at, quite frankly. Mm-hmm. And I think he liked it. And I think now that we see it all fall apart and his life fall apart so quickly, like, clearly he's a smart, intelligent guy. He could go on and do other things if he really wanted to. He could join the Soviet sphere and do more in that space, but it's not the same. And at the end of the day, he's a British gentleman who misses his own country, and but ultimately he made the choices that he made, and kind of is a sad and almost tragic end to his life. And I think he should ultimately be seen as really a tragic figure more than a national hero or just full-on traitor at this point. It's really just more, I think, from a personal side, it's just more of that traditional tragic figure.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think he is very much this tragic figure that was able to in this very backhanded way leverage his friendship and networks to being a very successful, double agent for the Soviets. There's actually a quote that stuck with me from Ben McIntyre's book, A Spy Amongst Friends. And I think it does a really good job at kind of getting to the heart of this discussion. And the quote is, "If I had to choose between betraying my country and betraying my friend. I hope I should have the guts to betray my country. And that's by E.M. Forrester. And I think this encapsulates that profound ethical dilemma that Philby and his counterparts faced. And it's this idea of loyalty, that personal loyalty to individuals can sometimes hold a greater moral weight than loyalty to something abstract like the idea of a country. And I think those words highlight that tension between individual relationships and these very vague, somewhat ambiguous, larger societal obligations, and where true moral courage lies. And I think this is a very interesting case study in how that can potentially work in the upper echelons of espionage.
Yeah, it's a very human story at the end of the day, right? Countries can change, allegiances could change, but those personal connections is what people are going to remember the most. And I think it's interesting with Kim and how he reflects on his life. It's the personal elements that he's remembering. It's not so much, I miss the British government and the crown. It's, I miss the countryside. I miss the people. I miss that way of life. I miss going to the pub and having a drink, like those sort of things that I think for someone like him the quote makes sense in that sense, because there really was no allegiance. I think, I even wonder with him, like if there is even an allegiance to the Soviet Union at some point, was it more of just an ideological viewpoint? And then, how did that shift over with some of the relationships that he was building? And he was building relationships with people in his life who were communist. And he saw that, maybe almost as a proxy of how do I get to the communist ideology as well through these relationships. And I think it's a good way to kind of, sum up his life on really understanding his motivations. Seem to be very deeply personal, but ultimately selfish in the same sense. So, I think it's a better way to look at it more so than, hey, how could you do these things to such a repressive regime of, I don't think that's necessarily was top of mind for him.
I think on a closing note, so going back to that podcast I had mentioned earlier, and we'll link it in the show notes. There's an excerpt in the episode where he proclaims to have, gave up on God at a very early age, that he was a self-proclaimed atheist, but that doesn't mean he didn't fill it with something else. And that kind of stuck with me. And I think communism, or this idea of communism, this ideology, kind of filled that void.
Absolutely. I think he needs a purpose, and ultimately it's communism, but also the thrill of spying and giving him purpose he was this double agent, and that's his identity. So I think that's a great way to end off, because I'm definitely walking away from this with coming in as, spy, defected, really just loved the Soviet Union and wanted it to succeed to, this is definitely more of a personal conquest, I think, for him. And I think that's a nice way to wrap up.
Yep. Awesome. Great episode. Thank you for listening, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Till next week.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the History in Motion podcast. If you enjoyed our journey through time, please subscribe, rate us, and share the podcast with friends. Your support helps keep history alive. Until next time.